Blood still dripped from the blade when the screams abruptly ceased in Revolution Square. It was July 15th, 1794, and the metallic smell of iron mixed with the sweat and urine of the crowd created a nauseating perfume that impregnated the uneven stones of the square. Among the spectators who clapped frantically, few knew that they had just witnessed not simply another execution of the terror, but the brutal end of a story that began with a simple piece of stolen bread and ended with the head of a child rolling in a blood-soaked wicker basket. Jean-Baptiste Moreau was only 13 years old when his thin, filthy fingers first closed around that still warm loaf of bread in the bakery on Saint-Antoine Street. The winter of 1792 bit into Paris with teeth of ice, and the streets, covered in frozen mud, echoed with the hurried footsteps of a hungry populace hunched against the cutting wind. Jean-Baptiste was no different from the hundreds of other orphaned children wandering the foul alleys of the capital, eyes too hollow for their age and ribs pressed against skin pale as prison bars. But there was something in his gaze, a calculating coldness that did not belong to that childlike face, that made adults avert their eyes when they found him skirting the shadows of the markets. That frozen December, when he stole his first loaf of bread, Jean-Baptiste discovered something that would forever change the course of his brief existence. He felt no remorse. While other street boys wept with guilt after small thefts, he methodically chewed every crumb, savoring not only the food, but the feeling of power that came with taking what he wanted. The baker's eyes, wide with surprise and fury, were seared into his memory, not as an image of shame, but as a trophy of his first victory against a world that denied him everything. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. Jean-Baptiste began observing people with the same cold attention that a cat gives to a wounded mouse. He learned to read the signs. Which merchant kept coins in his left pocket? Which woman hid jewels beneath her shawl? Which younger child could be intimidated into giving up their meager finds? His thefts became bolder, more calculated. The scrawny, apparently harmless boy developed a network of informants among the other orphans, promising them protection in exchange for information about valuable targets. When one of them betrayed him or simply became inconvenient, Jean-Baptiste found creative ways to dispose of the problem. It was in early 1793, when Paris seethed with aristocratic blood and the air constantly smelled of gunpowder and panic, that Jean-Baptiste committed his first murder. The victim was Pierre, a boy of only 9 years old, who had discovered the hiding place where Jean-Baptiste stashed his stolen treasures. The body was found 3 days later in the Seine, bearing strange marks on the neck that investigators attributed to river rats. But other street boys whispered different stories in the dark alleys, speaking of how Jean-Baptiste had followed Pierre to the docks that night, and that only one of them had returned. The city aflame provided the perfect cover for his activities. While the guillotine worked tirelessly in Revolution Square, reaping the heads of nobles and bourgeois with mechanical regularity, Jean-Baptiste built his own kingdom of terror in the narrow, fetid streets of the Saint-Antoine district. He did not kill for pleasure. That would be inefficient. He killed out of necessity for convenience, following a cold logic that treated human lives as obstacles to be removed. His methods were always discreet: a quick stab between the ribs during an apparently casual quarrel, an accidental shove off a high bridge, poison stolen from some apothecary and mixed into the victim's water or food. What made Jean-Baptiste truly terrifying was not his violence, but his ability to maintain a facade of childish innocence. He had perfected the art of crying on demand, making his blue eyes shine with false tears, while lying to authorities about his age, his origins, his intentions. When questioned about the whereabouts of other missing children, he could produce an expression of confusion so genuine that even the most experienced investigators were convinced of his innocence. His voice never betrayed emotion when he lied, always maintaining the high, hesitant tone typical of a frightened child. During the height of the terror, between 1793 and 1794, Jean-Baptiste expanded his operations. He no longer worked alone, but commanded a small gang of orphan boys he had collected from the streets. Some joined voluntarily, lured by the promise of food and protection. Others were coerced through a combination of psychological and physical violence that Jean-Baptiste applied with the precision of a practiced craftsman. He knew exactly how much pressure to apply to break a child's resistance without destroying their utility entirely. His subordinates quickly learned the rules of the game. Disobedience was punished with a calculated cruelty that left marks not only on the body, but on the soul. Jean-Baptiste had developed specific methods of torture that exploited each child's particular fears. For those who feared the dark, long periods locked in pitch-black cellars. For those who were afraid of heights, dangerous suspension above tall rooftops. For those who suffered from claustrophobia, confinement in progressively smaller spaces. He never raised his voice, never showed anger. He administered his punishments with the same neutral expression he wore for everything else, explaining patiently that it was necessary to maintain order. Jean-Baptiste's criminal empire grew in the shadows of the revolutionary terror, while Robespierre and his followers purged real and imagined enemies of the Republic. The 14-year-old boy built his own death machine in the streets of Paris. His profits came not only from thefts, but from a complex scheme of blackmail and extortion. He had learned that information was more valuable than gold, and his children spied on conversations in taverns, brothels, and private homes, collecting secrets that could be sold to the highest bidder or used to extort regular payments. Jean-Baptiste's network extended throughout Paris. He had informants among the servants of wealthy households, contacts in the markets who alerted him to valuable shipments, and even connections with some of the revolution's own executioners. Several minor officials of the revolutionary regime discovered it was cheaper to pay the boys silence than to risk having their own petty crimes or indiscretions exposed. Jean-Baptiste understood intuitively that even the most fervent revolutionaries had secrets they preferred to keep buried. But it was his gratuitous cruelty that began to attract unwanted attention. Unlike adult criminals who killed for passion or obvious gain, Jean-Baptiste seemed to find satisfaction in the methodical application of suffering. Witnesses later reported how he watched the expressions of his victims with scientific curiosity, as if studying the stages of human agony. He never rushed during an execution, preferring to prolong the process to extract the maximum amount of information about how different people reacted to the proximity of death. One of his most notorious victims was Marguerite Leblond, a 40-year-old woman who had the misfortune of refusing to pay the protection tax that Jean-Baptiste demanded of merchants in his area. Her death was discovered in her apartment 3 days after her refusal, but the official cause listed was natural death by sudden illness. The neighbors, however, whispered about the screams they had heard for 2 consecutive nights and about how Jean-Baptiste had been seen leaving the building on the morning the body was found. The doctor who examined Marguerite noted strange marks on her wrists and ankles, as if she had been bound, but was persuaded not to include these observations in his official report. Jean-Baptiste's preferred method for prolonged executions involved a combination of deprivation, psychological torture, and non-fatal injuries applied with surgical precision. He had stolen medical instruments from an abandoned hospital and learned, through brutal experimentation, exactly where to cut to cause maximum pain without causing immediate death. His victims were kept conscious throughout the process, forced to confront not only their impending mortality, but the horrific realization that they were in the hands of a child who treated their suffering as an intellectual game. Jean-Baptiste's personality was a study in disturbing contradictions. He could switch instantly between childish charm and homicidal coldness, sometimes in the middle of a single conversation. Those who encountered him casually on the streets saw only a skinny, well-spoken boy, perhaps a bit too serious for his age, but fundamentally harmless. He had perfected the art of blending in among other orphaned children, mimicking their mannerisms and expressions to appear just another face, among many. But his subordinates knew the truth. Behind those clear blue eyes lurked a calculating intelligence that saw people as pieces in a complex game. His crimes became more elaborate as his confidence grew. Jean-Baptiste began orchestrating complete scenarios for his executions, creating false narratives that would conveniently explain the disappearance or death of his victims. He studied the habits and relationships of each target, identifying natural enemies who could be blamed for the crimes. In several cases, he succeeded in having innocent people arrested and executed for the murders he himself had committed, thus eliminating both his original victims and any potential investigators into his activities. Jean-Baptiste's downfall began with his own arrogance. In the summer of 1794, when the terror reached its bloody zenith, he made the mistake of targeting a highly visible mark. Marie-Claire Dubois, the daughter of a moderately influential official of the Committee of Public Safety. Marie-Claire had inadvertently witnessed Jean-Baptiste coordinating the fatal beating of a rival boy, and he decided she needed to be silenced. But Marie-Claire was not a helpless orphan or an isolated merchant. When she disappeared, her father mobilized considerable resources to find her. The investigation that followed was unlike any before. Instead of local investigators easily intimidated or bribed, the case attracted the attention of specialized agents of the revolutionary regime, men accustomed to uncovering conspiracies and betrayals. They applied to the streets of Paris the same brutal interrogation methods they used against political suspects, and gradually began to piece together Jean-Baptiste's activities. Several of his subordinates, facing professional torture, broke and revealed details about their leader's organization and methods. What shocked the investigators was not only the extent of Jean-Baptiste's crimes, but their systematic, cold nature. They discovered meticulous records that the boy kept of his activities, including detailed drawings of the wounds he had inflicted and notes on the reactions of different victims. These documents revealed a mind that treated murder and torture as scientific experiments, recording variables and outcomes with the same objectivity a physician might use to document the progress of a disease. When Jean-Baptiste was finally captured in August 1794, he offered no resistance. In fact, he appeared almost relieved, as if he had grown tired of the game he had been playing. During the interrogations that followed, he confessed to his crimes, with disconcerting frankness, describing graphic details in the same calm voice he might use to discuss the weather. He showed no remorse, asked for no forgiveness, offered no justification for his actions. When questioned about his motivations, he simply replied that he had done what seemed logical and necessary under the circumstances. The interrogators, men, hardened by years of revolutionary violence, were visibly disturbed by Jean-Baptiste's confessions. His cold, methodical account of tortures and murders, delivered in the high voice of a child, created a cognitive dissonance that left them nauseated. Some later reported that they had nightmares about the boy, not because of his violence, but because of his complete lack of recognizable humanity. It was as if they were interrogating a machine designed to look like a child, but incapable of feeling any genuine human emotion. Jean-Baptiste's trial was swift, even by the standards of the terror. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his own confession eliminated any need for debate over guilt or innocence. What sparked debate was his age. At 15, he was technically below the traditional age for execution, but the nature of his crimes and his clear lack of remorse convinced the court that he posed a permanent danger to society. The decision to execute him was made not out of vengeance, but by a cold logic that echoed his own methods. Jean-Baptiste was a problem that needed to be eliminated. In the days leading up to his execution, Jean-Baptiste remained in the Conciergerie, prison, the same cell that had housed Marie Antoinette before her own walk to the guillotine. He spent his time observing the other prisoners with the same scientific curiosity he had applied to his victims. Guards reported that he asked detailed questions about the execution process, not out of fear, but out of genuine intellectual curiosity. He wanted to understand exactly how the guillotine worked, how long it would take to lose consciousness, whether it would be possible to see the blade fall across his neck. On the morning of his execution, Jean-Baptiste awoke before dawn and requested paper and ink. He used his final hours to write an extraordinary letter that survived in the revolutionary archives. In the letter, he did not confess his sins or ask for forgiveness, but coolly analyzed his own actions and motivations. He wrote about discovering that he lacked what others called conscience, and how that had been an advantage in a violent world. He speculated whether there were others like him, and whether they, too, would find that the absence of remorse was a powerful tool for survival. When the time came, Jean-Baptiste walked to the guillotine with the same composure he had maintained throughout his trial. The crowd that gathered to witness his execution was eerily silent, lacking the usual bloodthirsty cries that accompanied such events. There was something profoundly disturbing about seeing a child, because despite his crimes, Jean-Baptiste still looked young and fragile, walking calmly toward death. Many spectators later reported feeling as though they were part of something fundamentally wrong, even knowing that the execution was justified. Jean-Baptiste ascended the scaffold without assistance, refusing the prayers offered by the chaplain. He used his final moments to survey the crowd with clinical curiosity, as if memorizing their expressions for some future purpose. When the executioner placed his head on the block, Jean-Baptiste neither resisted nor trembled. His last words, audible only to those closest to the scaffold, were a question addressed to the executioner. "May I keep my eyes open to see the blade fall?" The blade fell at 11:47 a.m. on July the 15th, 1794. Jean-Baptiste Moreau's head rolled into the basket with a wet thud that seemed to echo through the square in unnatural silence. Yet even in death, he managed to disturb those who witnessed his execution. Several people in the crowd swore they saw his eyes move for several seconds after the decapitation, as though he was still observing and evaluating the world around him. Doctors dismissed these claims as impossible, but the rumors persisted, fueling nightmares about the boy who had died as coldly and calculatingly as he had lived. In the official records, Jean-Baptiste Moreau was listed simply as a minor executed for crimes against the Republic. But those who investigated his crimes carried away more disturbing memories. They had discovered that evil is not always obvious, not always accompanied by external signs of corruption. Sometimes it comes disguised as a skinny boy with clear, blue eyes and a soft voice, capable of smiling while planning his next execution. The true lesson of Jean-Baptiste's brief, violent life was not about poverty or desperation leading to crime, but about how a complete absence of human empathy could create a monster more terrifying than any corrupt aristocrat or political tyrant. His story became a whispered legend in the streets of Paris, a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking not only in the palaces of the powerful, but in the shadows where abandoned children fought for survival. Jean-Baptiste had proven that innocence and wickedness could coexist in the same young face, and that sometimes the greatest horror did not come from age or experience, but from the total absence of that which makes someone truly human. He had stolen his first loaf of bread out of hunger, but he had continued stealing lives for cold, calculating pleasure, proving that some monsters are not shaped by circumstances, but born fully formed, waiting only for the right opportunity to reveal their true nature.